career bests, stern words, and a slightly weird race. This week we're chatting all about the Canadian Grand Prix, so get ready because you've been summoned to the steward's office. Hello everyone and welcome back to the steward's office. I'm Syra and this week F1 headed out to Montreal for the Canadian Grand Prix. It is one of my favourite racetracks. I really love the flow of this track. I love seeing the drivers be on edge slightly, and it was a sprint weekend. It's the first time that Canada was hosting a sprint, and let's be honest, there was a lot going on. I watched this race back to back with the Indy 500, and yeah, it just felt like a bit of a fever dream at times watching the Canadian Grand Prix because it was a sort of blink and you miss it moment with a lot of things going on. And for me, in the run up to this race, there were two things I was probably reading a lot about online. One of them was obviously the Mercedes upgrades that were coming. A lot of teams bought their big upgrade to Miami, which was great, and we kind of saw McLaren really benefit from those upgrades and Red Bull benefiting. Mercedes opted to bring theirs a race later. They were ready for Canada, so I think a lot of people were wondering what impact that was going to have. So that was one thing I was really looking out for. But the other thing I kept reading about online were these rumours of issues between Esteban Ocon and his team principal, Komatsu, at Haas. Now, the rumours, if you hadn't read them or heard about them, were essentially Ocon and Komatsu had a huge blowout argument at Miami after the Grand Prix, and that Esteban was actually at risk of losing his seat midway in the season, that he wasn't even going to see the end of the season out. And look, I get that Esteban Ocon's performances have not been the best. Ollie Behrman has been outperforming him quite consistently. And the thing is, Komatsu has come out in the media and has said, yeah, we do expect more of Esteban. We do need more from him as a driver. And I don't think that was necessarily a mean thing to say. I think looking at the results, most people would agree, yeah, there should be more coming from Esteban Ocon's side of the garage. But nothing about an argument, nothing about him potentially losing his seat in the middle of the season. And oh my gosh, the reason I wanted to talk about these false rumours is because the way Komatsu came out into the media on Thursday media day for the Canadian Grand Prix to address it, and I'm so glad he addressed it in the way he did. He did question, it's like, is this journalism? Is this really what we're doing? Because there's such false rumours. Nothing like that happened. There's no risk of him losing a seat mid-season. Like, nothing like that has come up. And it is just insane to see the state sometimes of what these rumours are, and they're rumours for a reason, because 99% of the time they're not true. The other rumour that was floating around in the break between Miami and Canada was that Lewis Hamilton is going to be announcing he's retiring this year, and there was a really specific one that he was going to announce that he was retiring at the British Grand Prix this year. And he also went out into the press conferences and media on media day being like, nope, I'm going to be around for a while. You guys are going to have to get used to that. Everyone keeps trying to retire me. I'm not going anywhere. Unless it's being said in an official capacity by a member of the team, by a team principal, by a driver, there's no point in giving any fuel to these rumours, but it feels like so many outlets do grasp these rumours and then run with them. And they just get made into this huge deal, and it snowballs and snowballs and snowballs until someone puts an end to it. I'm just glad Esteban Ocon and Komatsu came out in the way they did and just said no, and if this is a state of journalism, we really need to reevaluate what is going on, because this isn't something worth reporting on because it hasn't even happened. Those are like the two storylines going in these false rumours around Ocon and Komatsu. Yeah, the Lewis Hamilton false retirement rumours, and obviously those huge Mercedes upgrades that were coming in. But let's actually have a chat about all of that on-track action now, starting with sprint qualifying. Look, it's going to be no surprise to anyone that, yeah, Mercedes locked out that front row in the sprint, and George Russell, when he gets to Canada, something happens, because let's be honest, past couple of race weekends, it's not been his weekend. It's firmly been Kimi Antonelli's weekend. And George Russell just hasn't been able to really extract enough from the car to put a huge challenge against Kimi Antonelli, and it's allowed Antonelli to lead the championship. But Canada is a racetrack that George Russell does so well at, and he managed to get sprint pulled. No surprises there when it comes to Mercedes. The surprise that I did have was Arvid Lindbergh getting into SQ3, and he's had a terrific season so far. There have been points that have not been that great, but I think he's doing pretty well with Racing Bulls. But the reason the SQ3 was a surprise, and a really nice surprise as well, is that this is his first ever visit to this circuit. So for him to get into SQ3 after only one practice session was amazing to see. I was also really, really surprised genuinely at the pace Lewis Hamilton had in his Ferrari. He had amazing pace in SQ1 and SQ2. I did think for a moment that he would be able to pull it together to get pole in SQ3. It just didn't happen. I don't know whether it was a timing issue on when he did his lap. I don't know whether it was just that the Mercedes hadn't unleashed their full pace up until SQ3, but he got P5, which still isn't bad. And I think the key thing for him was the fact that he came out of that saying it's the best he's ever felt in quali, I think, with that Ferrari car, which is a really, really good sign. Even if all the pace isn't there to challenge for pole, the fact that he's feeling better in it is definitely a good sign. And I mean, look, the misery carries on for Aston Martin. Fernando Alonso ended up locking up and crashing in SQ1 right at the end of SQ1. He had a time though, quick enough for P40. Nobody managed to get a quicker lap in when the session restarted. So he did get to keep that time, but because of the crash, he couldn't actually take part in SQ2. We also had two drivers that had to sit out a sprint qualifying. We had Liam Lawson and Alex Albon both not being able to take part because their cars had to be repaired after they had separate incidents in free practice. Going into the sprint though, this is where we had some interesting moments. And I think this is where we can see things at Mercedes are inevitably going to get more complicated, because right at the front of the field, Kimi Antonelli and George Russell made contact, were battling with each other, bumped wheels. We had Kimi Antonelli really, really unhappy on the radio, and it's the same with any driver that gets into that sort of situation, complaining down the radio to his race engineer, really unhappy with what his teammate's doing and what he thinks is unfair. And Bono is trying to calm him down, and Kimi is just not able to keep that calm head. And for a driver who is 19, only in his second season as well, I mean, it's not a huge surprise. But Toto Wolff did end up getting on the radio. Look, stop moaning, get on with it, keep your head down. And it's two things there, I think, for me. Is one, we can tell that Kimi is a brilliant driver, and I think he's going to have an amazing, amazing career ahead of him, and we're seeing it this season. He has a good chance to win the championship. But I think we also have to remember he is 19 years old, and he is only in his second season, and there are some things that he will just have to learn that sheer talent will not teach you. Things like keeping calm and keeping your head down when you have this sort of incidents, whether it's with another driver in another team or your teammate. That's something that you have to learn as you go on. But I think it also really showed us that, yeah, these two drivers in Mercedes, they know essentially at the moment that championship battle is between the two of them, and neither of them really want to concede. And Toto is very much about the team. It is important to bring the cars home. It's important to have both cars finish in a race and getting maximum points. And for the drivers, yes, they're driving for the team, they're driving for Mercedes, but at the end of the day, every single driver on that grid wants the championship for themselves. They want that driver's championship. And in those moments when you're battling with your teammate and it's two of you going head to head at the top of the championship, you are going to be way more focused on the driver's championship rather than thinking about the constructors. I think that sprint race kind of showed us the first sort of tensions that might start arising at Mercedes and the problems it could cause, because both drivers are super competitive and both drivers want that championship. Further down the grid, though, we had Fernando Alonso DNFing from the race, but ended up retiring midway through the race, actually, around lap 9, and then lap 10 came back out. He had an engine problem that they managed to sort out. Sergio Perez, 10-second time penalty, dropped down to P14, but was having a really good race before that. Pierre Gasly also had a 10-second time penalty. It was a bit of a messy sprint between the pits, random retirements, and the penalties. There was a lot going on there. George did end up winning though that sprint race. Then it was Lando, because the instance between Kimi and George and the bashing of wheels and Kimi going off track, it made him lose a lot of time, made Kimi lose a lot of time. So Kimi ended up in P3, which wasn't bad. You do wonder if they had been able to race a little bit cleaner if there hadn't been so much arguing on track whether Kimi could have been in P2, potentially P1, but we'll never know. Oscar Piastri finished in P4, then it was Charles Leclerc. Hamilton did have decent pace in this sprint, but towards the end, he ended up getting passed by both Oscar and Charles, which not great for him, but I don't know whether it was a tyre issue as they were coming off towards the end of the race or whether he was lacking power. But yeah, lost 2 places right at the end of the race. And it was Max Verstappen and Arvid Lindblad got the very last point of the sprint. Moving in quickly to qualifying, just a quick overview what happened there. Pole position went to George Russell once again. It had been a really good weekend for him up until this point. He had the sprint pole, the sprint win, the pole at qualifying, which I think for George, considering how the last couple of races have gone, he needed that sort of boost of confidence just for that mindset of like, you're still in this, you can still win this. Because mentally seeing your teammate, who is also a lot younger than you at 19, get these wins, get these pole positions, lead the championship at 19 years old, which I still can't wrap my head around. But that is going to sort of get you, even in small ways, psychologically and mentally. So I think having this really good run of results this weekend was going to do massive, massive things for him. And I think you could see in George's body language when he was going to the interviews afterwards, he looked a lot happier. There was more of a bounce in his step. He felt things were going his way. Not too far from his teammate, though, because Kimi Antonelli did end up P2 right next to him. The Mercedes cars, especially when we get into qualifying trim, the engine is so powerful. The aero works so well around that engine that it is hard to actually pull up against them and be competitive against the Mercedes cars. So once again, that front row lockout was not a surprise. Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen also had really, really good pace throughout qualifying. And I think for both of those drivers, this has not been the easiest season. Red Bull's car has been difficult for Max. He's not been happy with it. The upgrades have made him a little bit happier, which is always good. And for Lewis, he has just seemed happier this weekend overall and just seemed more confident with the car and his quali laps. Even though, okay, it wasn't front row, it wasn't pole position, you could see he was ringing everything out of that car. He was driving it on a knife's edge, the way he got so close to the world champions at times, but you could tell he was able to do that because he felt more confident and comfortable with the car. So that was a good sign. On the other side of that Ferrari garage though, Charles Leclerc, he was not happy in qualifying. I was genuinely worried at one point he was not making it into Q3. After Q2 though, when they were back in the garage before they went out for that final qualifying session, he was on the radio like, look, it's either going to be P8 or I'm going into a wall because I can't do anything else. He did finish in P8, so thankfully not into a wall, but he just was in no man's land. He even seemed confused as to why he couldn't extract anything out of the car properly. After qualifying, he was like, yeah, this is probably the worst weekend of my career, which I did think was a slight hyperbole, considering we have seen him crash multiple times in his home race, and I feel like that might top it. But for him, he genuinely thinks this was the worst weekend of his career, which fair enough. I mean, I think it could have been worse, but he just didn't seem to feel the car at all. And I mean, you've got Charles absolutely gutted at that PA, and Franco Colapinto, who got into Q3, was so happy, qualified in P10, but oh my gosh, he was chuffed to get through into Q3. So I mean, you can really see the difference there between teams and the expectations that the drivers have from their cars as well, and they have from themselves getting in to that race. Guys, I don't know what happened because I finished the Indy 500, which did finish late, went over to the Canadian Grand Prix, started it delayed, found out there were 3 formation laps that had to be done, and honestly, I don't know what happened. It's like I blinked and suddenly we were halfway through the race. I was not expecting all of that, and to be fair, me and one of my friends had said this is probably going to be a chaotic race. I just wasn't expecting all of this because when I swapped over to the Canadian Grand Prix and I saw both McLarens on intermediate tyres on what seemed to be a relatively dry track, I didn't know what was going on because none of the other top teams were on intermediates. They were all on soft tyres. And look, the FIA had put out like a weather warning because there was over 40% chance of rain for the Canadian Grand Prix. Spoiler alert, we had no rain whatsoever, but there were a couple of other teams further down the grid that put their drivers on intermediates. The track did not look that it was wet at all, if I'm honest with you. Cold, yes. They did say that it was a lot cooler in Canada, that the track was going to be quite cool compared to other sessions, but it didn't look like it was raining, and you could sense the immediate regret from Andrea Stella and both of the McLaren drivers on one of the formation laps. I think Piastri was like, yeah, we just need to come in and pit ASAP and get off the intermediates because this is not a good idea. What I will say for McLaren, though, is that Lando Norris, even on those intermediates, managed to get into the lead off the line. The Mercedes cars just did not have a great start, and somehow Norris on intermediates, out of all the tyres he could have been on, had a better start and took the lead. I mean, we're just going to run through everything with McLaren because there was a lot. They had an absolutely miserable race. And I think just from putting those intermediates on at the start, it was a chain reaction, especially for Oscar Piastri and what happened in his race. It was bad, and it's gutting because they seemed to be doing really well in the previous 3 sessions. I mean, we had Lando Norris get P2 in the sprint. We had him in the top 3 for the race during qualifying, and I don't know what went on at McLaren because we had a 10-second time penalty for Oscar Piastri, so he had to pit on lap 13 after he locked up trying to overtake Ollie Behrman. That lockup caused him to go right into the side pod of Alex Albon, who ended up having to retire from the race. Oscar managed to carry on, had to go in on lap 13 to change his tyres, and then had that 10-second time penalty added on. Lando Norris eventually did pit. He was on the intermediate tyres for a little bit longer than Oscar. Not that long, but a little bit longer. Pitted, had to pit again on lap 16 because they needed to check. They were worried there was a reliability issue. He ended up later on in the race having to retire because he had a broken gearbox. No points at all for McLaren during that race. Like I said, Lando Norris was a DNF. Oscar Piastri finished in P11, 2 laps down from the race leader. 2 laps. That's insane when I think about it, because McLaren looked really strong out in Miami. It looked like their upgrades were working really well. It's bringing them closer to Mercedes, and I was genuinely excited to see what they could do in Canada. I thought they would be competitive. We kind of saw it in the sprint. Qualifying looked good. I thought maybe they'll be able to stay with Mercedes in the race, and it just all fell apart for them. The incident for Oscar Piastri, I do think it's a byproduct of having those intermediates on, having to pit after the first lap, and then you're dragged back in to that midfield, backfield with all of the traffic there. Lando Norris, just awful luck. The gearbox just not wanting to work and giving up on him. He looked like he was having the time of his life coming back to the paddock, though. There's a picture of him on the back of a moped that a marshal is driving for him, and he looks like he's having the time of his life there. But yeah, for McLaren overall, miserable day. I think they had the chance to score some really good points, and it all fell away the minute they put those intermediates on. I think I have to talk about Mercedes next because they had an interesting race. All of that battling that they had in the sprint, they carried on at the Grand Prix. Not a surprise because there are even more points up for grabs at the Grand Prix, but Kimi Antonelli was on a mission to try and get that race win. He had huge lockups trying to pass George around lap 6-7. Some really dicey racing from him this weekend. We had complaints on the radio of Kimi Antonelli being like, I don't know why I need to give a place back to George. He pushed me off. It was quite dicey, and I thought we're in for a race of these two just going head to head. And it didn't exactly happen because George Russell's engine gave up on him. Completely just gave up on him. No incident. No sort of damage to the car from anything that had happened to him brushing up against a wall or anything like that. Suddenly he just lost power and had to retire from the race. And you could tell how annoyed, angry and disappointed he was in that result, because it's one thing to, okay, Kimi Antonelli finishing in first and George finishing in second, right? 25 points, 18 points. Okay, you could deal with that. To walk away with nothing from a race. And George had said in interviews before, like, those are the races that I have to try and avoid, are the races where I walk away with nothing. A slight points deficit is okay, you can make up for that. Walking away with 0, it's really hard to make up those points if Kimi has a really good race result then. And that is exactly what happened, because Kimi ended up winning that race, and I think one of the Mercedes was obviously going to with the pace that they had, but for George, he walked away with nothing. Like I said though, before that, there was just so much battling between those Mercedes cars. There was contact between them, hard battling, which, okay, yes, in terms of the FIA rules, completely legal. I can't imagine Mercedes themselves are too happy. Toto Wolff, their race directors, all the rest of it. I can't imagine they're too happy. Because like I said, for the rest of the team, it is about bringing both the cars home, making sure that they win the constructors. And they did have words with both George and Kimi Antonelli. Their race directors both had words with them where it's like, no, it has to be clean racing. You have to leave each other room. And if you guys don't do that, we are going to call off you guys being able to race each other. Like, we're not going to allow that, which I really hope doesn't happen at any point this season. Regardless of whether they're teammates or not, you want to see good hard racing, but I think for Toto and the team, there's just a line that should not be crossed. And after everything that happened, Lewis and Nico Rosberg, they definitely do not want a replay of that. Do I think we are potentially going to get an incident between both of those drivers at some point this season? Yes, because they're both hungry for it. George has waited years to be in this Mercedes car that's competitive. The first couple of years of the team were not. It was a difficult time for that Mercedes car when he first joined the team. He now has a car that is really competitive, that looks dominant. And then you've got Kimi Antonelli, who is this 19-year-old, second season of F1. And he has had so much pressure on his shoulders, so many expectations. He wants to win. He wants to take that title home at the end of the year. Both of them are desperate for it in very different ways, but they both want that same end goal. So I can see an incident happening at some point. It does just feel like, yeah, we are edging towards a civil war at Mercedes at this point, if the Canadian Grand Prix is anything to go by, and I don't think the DNF on George's half the garage is going to help. There was a slight incident after George did DNF that I just want to bring up, because after that DNF, he had stopped on the side of the track with the car, threw the headrest out of the car onto the track before getting out, right? And I get it that he was upset and angry and disappointed, and I think we all react in certain ways when something has happened like that and it hasn't gone our way and we're upset by it. The FIA did have to investigate that. I think it was basically they had to investigate what was an unsafe action, and they ended up having to penalise him for it in the way of a suspended fine. So he's been fined €5,000, which has been suspended for 12 months as long as he doesn't do something like that again. He did go and apologise to the stewards when he got summoned to the office. He said, yeah, it wasn't a good example and he shouldn't do that. He offered to apologise publicly. There was chat about whether or not online, I think the commentators were talking about it as well, about whether or not he should be penalised for that in any kind of way, whether it's a fine or whatever, because, you know, you shouldn't have to be fined for being upset or being angry or anything like that. I do disagree slightly on that matter, just because, look, it's still an active racetrack, even though I think it was a VSC that came out. Whether it was a VSC or a safety car, regardless, there are still cars on track. And yes, the speed is more controlled, but if that headrest had not gone right in front of his own car, had gone onto the track, had caused an incident for another driver, that is a safety problem. And I do think you have to find a way to make sure drivers don't do that again and make sure they know that it's not okay. So I do think it's fair giving him that suspended fine. Do I think it needs to be anything bigger, like a grid drop in the next race? Absolutely not. But I think it is fair for him to have been penalised. But that was Mercedes. Ferrari and Red Bull, they had a fairly similar sort of race, right? In that two drivers had a really great race, were really, really happy, and two drivers were not. Lewis Hamilton had a brilliant race. He was driver of the day. He finished in P2. He looked so happy, and he said post-race, look, I didn't go on the sim. What I did end up doing was going through all of the data with my engineer. My second engineer really helped me, like, hone in that car to what I needed, what was going to help me. We just went through the data and worked from there on the car setup. I went in a different direction. It really helped. And I think for him, he was going to probably stay away from the simulator because he said last race, it's what wasn't helping. But he was super happy with that P2. Had an amazing battle with Max Verstappen right at the end of the race, where Max was ahead of him. after Lewis had overtaken him, there was still that battle there. Max was still nipping at his heels, and clean racing, good racing, and Max was really happy as well. It's his first podium of the season, which is crazy considering we're at Canada, we're 5 races in and we haven't seen him on a podium yet. But yeah, he also really enjoyed the race, seemed a lot happier with the car. So I think the upgrades on Max's half really working for him, and for Lewis, just being able to go through the data and get the setup from that instead of the simulator has really helped. So 2 super happy drivers, which was great. The other 2 drivers though, look, Charles was not happy, did not have the pace. I mean, the battle ahead of him was Max and Lewis, and he didn't have the same pace as them. He just couldn't seem to do it. And it wasn't that his pace was super off, but he just wasn't able to extract any more from the car. His race engineer was trying to give him advice, and it did get to a point towards the end of the race where Charles was like, you know what, no, I don't want to hear anything, just let me know when it's the final lap, or if there's anything that you absolutely need to tell me about the car. Other than that, just leave me alone. He finished P4, which, like, on the face of it, P4 I think is a decent result, but he finished half a minute behind Max Verstappen, and I think that's sort of where the issue was for him. Isaac Hadjar finished P5. Once again, on the face of it, finishing P5 is really good. Great for Red Bull, great for Isaac Hadjar. However, he had a 10-second time penalty for changing direction twice whilst he was defending against Charles Leclerc, and then he had a stop and go penalty for a yellow flag infringement and not lifting during those yellow flags. So I don't think it was like an awful race in terms of when you look at the results, but for Isaac, yeah, it didn't change his race result because P6 was, I think, like 30-40 seconds behind him. However, yeah, that is penalty on top of penalty is not great. But those are sort of like the title contenders in terms of constructors and drivers. Midfield was also quite interesting. I was gutted after Arvid Lindblad scored that point in the sprint. He didn't even start the race. He stalled as the drivers went to do another formation lap and then had to get rolled back to the garage. So he was a DNS. I got super excited for Fernando Alonso, who was in P10 for the first couple of laps, right? And I know I shouldn't have gotten excited because he ended up retiring less than halfway in. There was a problem with the seat, apparently. It's something that had been cropping up throughout the weekend, and it just caused such a problem that he ended up having to retire from the race. So at the moment, the car's not great, the engine's not great, and apparently the seat's not great either. Sergio Perez had, I think it was his suspension that randomly broke. He was a DNF, and this was actually a really good weekend for him before that. The pace looked really good, and yeah, he ended up having to retire. Audi did not have the best race either. Both drivers were out of the points and just didn't have great pace. I will say that Alpine actually looked really good. It seems like they've gotten to grips with the car, the engine, the upgrades have helped, and they look a little bit more competitive in that midfield. It was really good for them. A double points finish for Alpine, Pierre Gasly in P8, and for Franco Colapinto it was P6, which is a career best finish for him. So absolutely chuffed for Franco Colapinto. Second race in a row, he has been the leading Alpine driver. Something has just clicked for him recently, and it's been amazing to watch. It was just an insane race though, to be fair. Like, this entire race was wild. We had Valtteri Bottas finishing the race 4 laps behind, and I don't even understand how that happened. We had 6 DNFs, or 6 non-finishers, because Arvid Lindblad was DNS. We had Alex Albon, Fernando Alonso, George Russell, Lando Norris, and Sergio Perez all DNFing from the race. Valtteri and Lance 4 laps behind. I think, let me double check. Yeah, it was only up to P4. Charles Leclerc was the only car, other than the podium sitters, that was on the lead lap. From P5, which was Isaac Hadjar, down, everyone was at least a lap down. I don't even know how that managed to happen. So let's go to our winners and losers of this Grand Prix, which I will firmly say still feels like a fever dream for me when I look at all of that. I mean, I gotta say the entire podium are up there because they all had a brilliant race. They were so happy, and it was an iconic podium. I mean, you have Lewis Hamilton with 7 world championships, Max Verstappen with 4, and then Kimi Antonelli, who at 19 is leading this championship. That is insane. So yeah, I think all 3 of them definitely winners for this race. And then I'd also say Alpine and specifically Franco Colapinto to have his career best finish, but for both drivers to be in the points, P6 and P8, great points for that midfield battle. Losers, right, here we go. Okay, so we've got everyone who DNF'd, all those 6 drivers. George Russell obviously has to be on there. So disappointed and gutted for him and his race. Both of the McLaren cars, the team to walk away with absolutely no points at the Canadian Grand Prix is hard, and it opens up that space between them and Ferrari in that Constructors' Championship. And I'd also say Charles Leclerc. My sister also said I should add in his race engineer for being told not to talk to Charles anymore. It's like I said, I don't think P4 was a bad result, but yeah, considering how the race went, I can understand why he is disappointed. That is the Canadian Grand Prix though, guys. I don't know what happened. I'm not sure how half of it happened, but yeah, Kimi Antonelli continuing to lead the championship, opening up that gap with George Russell. Adding 25 points onto that gap is insane and really going to help his championship chances. We have Ferrari and Red Bull getting more comfortable with the car, seeming a bit more competitive. It's all still to play for. Monaco's coming up next, and that is a track that isn't necessarily going to depend on engine power, and a lot of people think it's going to be Ferrari's best chance. Ferrari, I think, are cautiously optimistic that they could have a really good result here, but I think it is one of their best chances to have a race win if they were going to do it this season. But yeah, what an interesting race. A lot going on, and Monaco is gonna be an interesting one. But thank you guys so much for listening and watching. Please follow me on TikTok and Instagram at stewards_office, and subscribe to me on YouTube. I will see you guys the next time you're summoned to the Stewards office.